This is a work of complete fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental. Cassandra Reed picked up the place card herself. She had written it the night before, in her own handwriting, with a glass of wine in her other hand and a smile she didn't bother hiding. She set it down at the table where Selina Vale would be seated, between a junior accountant nobody talked to and a floral centerpiece tall enough to block her from view, and she stood back to admire it the way a person admires a piece of work they're genuinely proud of. The card read, Selina Cross Das, Trophy Wife, +1, does not work. Selina found it 40 minutes into the gala. She read it twice. Then she looked across the ballroom at Ethan, who was laughing at something Cassandra had just said, his hand on his boss's arm, completely at ease in a room full of people who had just watched his wife get quietly gutted at her own dinner seat. He hadn't seen it yet. Or maybe he had. That was the part that would take her the longest to forgive, not knowing which one was true. If this story moves you, please hit the like button and drop a comment with the name of the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The invitation had come 6 weeks earlier, slipped into the pile of Ethan's work correspondence like it was nothing. A cream-colored envelope with the Nexora Systems logo embossed in silver, the kind of stationery that announced money before you even broke the seal. The annual Nexora Leadership Gala, Claridge's Hotel, London. Black tie. Attendance expected. Selina had pulled the card out and read it standing in the kitchen in her socks, still holding a mug of tea that had gone cold. She turned it over, checked the back for any additional note, found none. She set it on the counter next to Ethan's keys. "We're going to the gala," she said when he came in from the hallway. Ethan glanced at the envelope without stopping. "I know. Cassandra mentioned it this morning." "Did she mention whether spouses were actually welcome this year, or is it the same situation as the Edinburgh Summit?" He opened the refrigerator. "That was a working trip, Sel. Different thing. You were gone for 5 days. I told you about Edinburgh 2 months in advance." He pulled out a container of leftover pasta. Didn't look at her. "The gala is different. It's a social event. Of course you're coming." She had wanted to believe him. That was the truth she'd return to later, in the quiet of the apartment after the gala, when she was sitting at the kitchen table with her shoes off and her mascara destroyed. She had genuinely wanted to believe him, because wanting to believe someone and trusting them aren't the same thing. And somewhere in the years between the woman she used to be and the woman she'd become, Selina Vale had let herself confuse the two. She had been 29 when she and Ethan met, and she had been formidable in ways that made people slightly uncomfortable at dinner parties. She worked financial fraud investigation for a mid-size firm out of Canary Wharf, not the flashy corporate kind with a glass lobby and a coffee bar on every floor, but the serious kind, the kind where you spent 3 weeks buried in a company's subsidiary filings looking for the one irregular entry that would eventually bring the whole structure down. She was good at it. Not good in the way people say when they mean she works hard and she's pleasant. Good in the way that meant she saw things other people missed, that she could hold a complex financial structure in her head the way some people hold music, that she had twice been called to consult on cases that eventually became front-page news. She met Ethan at a colleague's birthday gathering. Not a party exactly, just 12 people in a bar in Shoreditch. The kind of low-key event where you end up talking to whoever's nearest because the music isn't loud enough to justify not talking. He was there with a friend who worked in the same building. He was tall, dark-haired, with an easy smile and a quality she would later identify as performing confidence. Not the real kind, but convincing enough that it takes years to tell the difference. He asked what she did. She told him. He leaned forward like he was genuinely interested, which he probably was at the time. She asked what he did. He was a mid-level product manager at a tech startup she'd vaguely heard of. He had ambitions, he said. He wanted to move into a larger firm within the year. He had a plan. She liked the plan. She liked that he had one. 3 years later, they were married. 2 years after that, the ambition he'd described in that Shoreditch bar had started to materialize in ways that required accommodations she hadn't anticipated. Longer hours, a job change that meant relocating from Manchester back to London, networking events that were really more of a couple's thing, but somehow always ended with Selena standing alone near the appetizers while Ethan worked the room. She didn't complain mostly. She cut back her own hours when the demands on his time made their schedule impossible to manage. She took on less complex cases so she'd be available when he needed her to be available. She told herself this was temporary, a season, the kind of compromise that long-term partnership required. Then one afternoon she got a call from her manager, a blunt Scotsman named Douglas, who had recruited her out of graduate school and who didn't soften things as a matter of professional principle. He told her that the Hargrove case, a securities manipulation investigation she'd been lead analyst on for 14 months, was being handed to another team because her availability had become unpredictable and the client was nervous. She sat in her car in a parking garage for 20 minutes after that call. She didn't cry. She just sat there with the phone in her lap and thought about the Hargrove files, about the 18-month arc she'd traced through dummy accounts and fabricated revenue projections, about how close she was, and about the fact that she had no one to blame but the series of small surrenders she'd made voluntarily. When she got home, Ethan was already there, and she started to tell him about Hargrove, and he listened for about 45 seconds before he said, "I'm sorry, Sel, that's genuinely rough. Can we talk about it after dinner? Cassandra moved the product review to next week, and I need to prep a revised timeline before tomorrow morning." She had said, "Of course." She had made dinner. They had talked about his timeline. She did not bring up Hargrove again. The thing about Cassandra Reed was that she was brilliant, and she knew it, and she had spent enough years being the smartest person in rooms that weren't ready to acknowledge it, that she'd developed a particular kind of contempt, not for stupidity, but for people she considered beneath her current position. People who had coasted, people who benefited from proximity to power without earning it themselves. Selena Vale, in Cassandra's estimation, was that kind of person. She had made this clear in small ways over the 3 years she'd been Ethan's direct superior at Nexora Systems. A slight delay in learning Selena's name, an offhand comment at a company dinner about support spouses that landed with precision and was immediately walked back with a smile. The Edinburgh Summit invitation that excluded partners with such specific wording that Selena had read it 4 times to confirm she hadn't misunderstood. Cassandra never said anything she couldn't deny. She was too careful for that. But the place card at the Claridge's Gala was different. That was a choice that required effort. Someone had to think about what to write, decide to write it, physically produce it, and place it at the correct seat in a ballroom full of assigned positions. It was not a slip. It was not an offhand remark that got away from her. It was deliberate, and it was signed, in a way, not with a name, but with Cassandra's characteristic handwriting, which Ethan had shown Selena once on a card she'd sent with a bottle of wine to their apartment. The wide looping capitals, the aggressive underline. Selena knew immediately. She had dressed carefully for the gala. She wasn't someone who dressed carelessly for anything, but this was different. Ethan had mentioned 3 times in the preceding week that Cassandra would be there with her full executive team, that the firm's major investors would be attending, that it was one of those evenings where impressions matter. He said it the way people say things when they're not sure whether they're communicating anxiety or a warning, maybe both. She wore a deep navy dress she'd bought 2 years ago and never had occasion to wear. Fitted, clean lines, not trying too hard but not invisible either. She did her own hair and kept the jewelry minimal. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror before they left, she had looked at herself and thought, for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, "I know who I am." It was a strange thought to have on the way to a party. She tucked it away. The car Nexora had arranged collected them at 7:15. Ethan was on his phone for most of the ride, typing something she didn't ask about. She looked out the window at London moving past, the wet November streets, the lit facades of hotels and banks, couples walking under umbrellas. She felt something she couldn't quite name. Not dread, exactly. Something closer to the sensation of a held breath. Claridge's was everything its reputation promised, and a little more. The lobby made a specific argument about what success looked like, and it made it without apology. Marble and brass and floral arrangements that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. Waiting staff who moved with the particular smoothness of people trained to be invisible. The ballroom had been dressed for the event in Nexora's colors, silver and charcoal, And the effect was impressive in the way that things built to impress always are. It worked, and you knew it was working on you, and you couldn't quite resist it anyway. Ethan found Cassandra almost immediately. Selena watched him cross the room. The way his posture changed when he spotted her, the slight straightening of his spine, the smile that came up too quickly to be entirely natural. Cassandra was standing with a cluster of men Selena didn't recognize, wearing a floor-length ivory gown that was either very expensive or a very good replica, her dark hair pulled back in something architectural. She received Ethan the way people receive things they expected. She looked past him to Selena with an expression that could be read as welcoming if you didn't know her. "Selena," she said. "You came." "Of course," Selena said. She held Cassandra's eye just long enough. "I've put you at table 7, Cassandra said, already turning back to the group. "Lovely position near the arrangements." Table 7 was near the arrangements the way a waiting room is near a hospital. Technically accurate and missing the entire point. Basam. The first hour was the kind of event endurance that Selena had developed a grim competence at over the years. Canapés she didn't want. Conversations she had to initiate with people who didn't know her name and didn't try to learn it. Ethan moved through the room on Cassandra's periphery, laughing at the right moments, touching arms, projecting the version of himself he'd been carefully constructing for the past 7 years. He stopped by Selena twice, once to introduce her to a CFO whose name she immediately lost, once to ask if she wanted another drink in a tone that communicated he hoped she'd say no so he could keep moving. She said no. He moved. She found her table eventually, guided there by a young woman with a tablet and a practiced smile. Table 7 was, as described, near the floral arrangements, large enough to significantly obstruct the view from her seat, and positioned at an angle that meant she was looking at the back of the main presentation area rather than the front. The other guests at her table were a junior accountant from Nexora's Bristol office, who introduced himself as Marcus, and then seemed unsure what to do next, a woman named Patricia, who was someone else's spouse and spent most of the evening scrolling discreetly through her phone, and 3 others who arrived late and talked among themselves. Selena sat down. She adjusted her napkin. She looked at the place card in front of her. She read it once. She picked it up and read it again to make sure. Selena Cross. Trophy wife. +1. Does not work. The room didn't go quiet. Nobody around her saw it or noticed. Marcus was trying to flag down a waiter. Patricia was looking at her phone. The ballroom continued at full volume, crystal and conversation and the distant, efficient sounds of a string quartet. Selena set the card back down. She picked up her water glass. She took a slow sip. She set it down. She looked across the room and found Ethan. He was 15 feet away, standing with Cassandra and 2 other executives, and he was laughing, head back slightly, easy, genuine looking. The laugh of a man who was comfortable, who felt safe. Selena looked at Cassandra, who in that moment turned and caught her eye across the room. Cassandra's expression didn't shift. She held the look for 1 second, then 2, then turned back to the conversation with the absolute ease of someone who expects no consequences. What happened next was not a scene. Selena was specific about that later, when she told it to herself, when she stood at the window at midnight with the city below her and tried to understand what had broken and what had simply, finally been allowed to stop pretending. It was not dramatic. There was no confrontation. She did not throw the place card across the table or go to Ethan and take his arm and make him look at it. She stood up. She folded her napkin. She collected her clutch from the back of the chair. Marcus looked up. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. "Just getting some air." She moved through the ballroom with the practiced calm of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and has decided not to hurry. She passed the bar without stopping. She passed a cluster of Nexora executives who didn't notice her. She passed a woman in a red dress who was laughing too loudly at something. She kept moving. Near the main doors, the Nexora CEO, a broad-shouldered man named Jeffrey Marsh, who had been with the company 12 years and whose signature was on every major filing Selena had spent the past 3 weeks reading, was standing alone for a brief moment, checking his phone. She stopped. She had not planned this. She would think about that later, too. Whether it had been planned without her knowing it, whether the 3 weeks she'd spent in front of her laptop after Ethan went to sleep had been building toward something she hadn't yet admitted to herself. She decided eventually that it didn't matter. Some things happen because the moment makes them possible and the person is finally ready. She stopped next to Jeffrey Marsh. He looked up from his phone, vaguely courteous. He didn't know her name. She could see it in his expression, the rapid, unconscious calculation of who is this and should I recognize her. "Mr. Marsh," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely level. "I'm Ethan Cross's wife." A small, professional nod. "Of course. Lovely evening." She leaned toward him very slightly. Not aggressively, just enough to make it clear she was speaking directly to him and not to the room. "Check your stock prices tomorrow," she said. "There are things in your public filings you should know about before someone else tells you." She held his eye for 3 seconds. Then she straightened, smiled in the polite, unremarkable way of someone who has just exchanged pleasantries at a party, and walked out through the main doors into the November air. Shata. The cab home took 22 minutes. She knew because she counted, sitting in the back seat with her hands in her lap and her heels still on, and something churning in her chest that was not grief exactly, and not anger, and not the hot shame of a woman who'd just been publicly insulted. It was something older than all of those. Something she recognized from a long time ago, from the version of herself who used to sit in the corner of her firm's conference room with a stack of filings and the quiet certainty that she was going to find it. The buried thing, the hidden number, the carefully engineered lie. She recognized focus. The apartment was empty and dark when she got in. She didn't turn on many lights. Just the lamp in the second bedroom, the one she used as an office, the one Ethan had suggested twice they convert into a proper guest room since you barely use it anymore. She sat down at her desk. She opened her laptop. She opened a new browser window and pulled up the SEC public filing database, cross-referencing it with the company's house portal for Nexora's UK subsidiaries. She had the first set of irregularities within 40 minutes. She worked until 3 in the morning. At some point, she took off her heels and put them neatly under the desk. At another point, she made tea and let it go cold again. She pulled up Nexora's annual reports for the past 4 years, their quarterly earnings disclosures, their executive compensation filings, the subsidiary registrations in 2 jurisdictions that didn't quite line up with the revenue figures reported to investors. She pulled up Cassandra Reed's professional history, the CFO positions before Nexora, the advisory board roles, the pattern of joining high-growth companies in their pre-IPO phases and exiting with compensation packages that required significant accounting flexibility to justify. It was all publicly available. That was what made it stunning. Not that it was hidden, but that nobody had looked. Or maybe nobody had wanted to. At 3:15, Ethan came home. She heard his key in the lock, heard him move through the dark apartment, heard him stop outside the office door. "Sell?" He sounded tired and slightly cautious. "You left early. I didn't know where you'd gone." She didn't turn around. "I went home." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm working." Another pause, longer. She could feel him trying to read the situation, trying to decide which version of this conversation he was walking into. "It's past 3, he said. "I know what time it is." "Selena!" "Go to sleep, Ethan." She said it quietly and without edge. Not cold, just final. "I'll be in later." He stood there for a moment. She kept her eyes on the screen. Then she heard him move away down the hallway, heard the bedroom door close gently, and she turned back to the numbers. The next morning she was up before him. She made coffee, which she drank standing at the kitchen counter, and she looked at the notes she'd made. 3 pages, front and back, in the sharp, compressed handwriting she hadn't used in years because she hadn't had reason to. The kind of notes that had a direction, a thread pulling through them. Ethan appeared at 7:40, already dressed, looking like he'd slept poorly. He poured himself coffee. He stood across the counter from her and she could see him measuring something. The distance between what had happened last night and what he was willing to address this morning. "You seemed upset when you left," he said. "I was." He waited. When she didn't continue, "Do you want to talk about it?" She looked at him. He was 41 years old. He had a good face. She'd always thought so, still did. And in this moment it was doing what it sometimes did under pressure, which was go slightly careful, slightly managed. Not dishonest exactly, but managed. Did you see the place card? She asked. Something shifted in his expression. Very small, very quick. What place card? She studied him. At table 7, the one with my name on it. He shook his head slowly. I wasn't at your table most of the evening. What did it say? She told him. She kept her voice even and watched his face. He went through the expected sequence: confusion, then something that looked like discomfort, then the beginning of what she recognized as the framework for an explanation that would ultimately redirect the focus. She'd seen this sequence before. Not with Ethan specifically, but with people under examination, people who know more than they're saying and are trying to figure out how much they need to give up. He put his coffee cup down. That's completely unacceptable. I'll speak to Cassandra. About what specifically? Obviously about the place card. That's harassment, Selena. I'll address it directly. And what will you say? He blinked. I'll tell her it was inappropriate. She nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee. She took a sip. Okay, she said. He seemed to expect more. Okay? Yeah. She put the mug down and picked up her notes from the counter, tapping them straight against the surface. Let me know how that goes. She went back to the office. She heard him in the kitchen for another few minutes, heard him rinse his cup, heard him stand there, probably trying to decide if the conversation was over or if it had just started in a way he didn't yet understand. Then she heard him pick up his bag, heard the front door. She sat down and opened her laptop. What Selena was looking at, what had kept her up until 3 in the morning and would keep her up for several nights to come, was not, on the surface, unusual. Companies like Nexora operated in the kind of regulatory environment where creative accounting was almost an expectation, where the gap between what the filing said and what the actual financial position was could be explained as timing differences or conservative estimates, or the dozen other phrases that experienced financial officers used to describe the deliberate blurring of lines. But there were lines that couldn't be blurred past a certain point. There were figures that, when you put them next to each other in the right configuration, stopped being a matter of interpretation. Nexora's core revenue reporting was straightforward enough. Software licensing, subscription services, a hardware division that was modest but stable. What was less straightforward was the relationship between the parent company's reported earnings and the financial activity of 3 subsidiaries registered in jurisdictions with limited disclosure requirements. She'd found 2 of them in the public filings. The third she found through a cross-reference with an investor disclosure document from 18 months ago that mentioned a partnership with a consulting entity she'd never heard of. She spent 2 days building the picture. The consulting entity, listed only as ReadCap Advisory in a single footnote, was not hard to trace if you knew how to look. It was registered in the Channel Islands. Its sole listed director was a woman named Margaret Hollis. Selena spent 4 hours on that name before she found the connection. A Companies House filing from 2019 in which Margaret Hollis appeared as a co-signatory with Cassandra Reed on a property transaction in Surrey. Not proof of anything by itself, but it was a thread. She pulled it. By the end of the week, she had built something that was not a case, not yet, not in the formal sense, but was the structure of a case, the shape of one, the kind of shape that, when you've done this work long enough, you recognize the way you recognize weather coming in from a certain direction. It has a feeling. It has a weight. ReadCap Advisory was receiving consulting fees from Nexora at a rate that bore no relationship to any services rendered. The fees were categorized under operational expenses in a way that allowed them to reduce taxable revenue without appearing in executive compensation disclosures. Cassandra Reed was not listed as a director of ReadCap. She was not listed in any document as having any relationship to it at all. But the money moved from Nexora to ReadCap, and it had been moving for 3 years, and the amount was not small. And that was before Selena found the stock trading records. Well, she found those on a Thursday afternoon, cross-referencing SEC Form 4 disclosures, the insider trading reports that senior executives are required to file whenever they buy or sell shares in their own companies. The forms were all there, publicly available, filed correctly and on time. What they showed, taken individually, was entirely legal. What they showed when you mapped them against a specific sequence of earnings announcements and subsequent price movements was something considerably more interesting. Cassandra Reed had sold significant blocks of Nexora stock in the 6 to 8 weeks preceding each of the company's 4 most significant earnings disappointments over the past 3 years. Not all of her shares, not in a single dramatic transaction that would immediately flag an algorithm, but in measured, spaced-out disposals that, when aggregated, represented a pattern of exit preceding negative news. The question that the filings didn't answer, the question that made this the threshold of something serious rather than an interesting coincidence, was whether Cassandra had known the bad news was coming before it became public. Whether she had, in other words, traded on information that investors relying on the company's disclosures did not have access to. Selena sat with this for a long time. She had worked enough fraud cases to know what this kind of pattern looked like. She also knew what it didn't prove. She knew the gap between a suspicious pattern and a demonstrable violation, and she knew that gap could swallow years of work if you didn't approach it carefully. She also knew from years of watching cases like this get buried, by firms who didn't want the exposure, by lawyers who drew out timelines until evidence went cold, by executives who were careful enough to always maintain a layer of deniability, that the most efficient path from a pattern to a consequence was not through formal channels alone. She made a call. The person she called was a woman named Roz Hart, who Selena had worked with 8 years ago during a corporate accounting case that had eventually resulted in 2 criminal referrals and a front-page story in the Financial Times. Roz now worked independently, consulting mostly, and doing the kind of work that didn't always fit neatly into a job title. She had contacts in financial journalism. She had contacts in regulatory enforcement. She knew how to move information from the private domain to the public one without it being traceable back to its origin. They met for coffee in a cafe in Bermondsey that Roz had chosen because it was the kind of place nobody would expect them to be. Not unfashionable exactly, just anonymous. The sort of corner spot that had been there 30 years and expected to be there 30 more. Roz listened without interrupting. Selena laid out what she had. Not everything, not the deepest thread, but enough. She watched Rose's face as she listened. Roz had a particular expression when she was genuinely engaged with something, very still, very level, with a slight tightening around the eyes. She had that expression now. When Selena finished, Roz was quiet for a moment. "This is Nexora," Roz said. "Yes." "Cassandra Reed's Nexora." "Yes." Roz looked at the table. Then she looked up. "How long have you had this?" 10 days. "How confident are you in the ReedCap connection?" "Confident enough to show someone, not confident enough to sign my name to it alone." Roz nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee, set it down. "There's a journalist at the Herald. She's been watching Nexora for about 6 months, but hasn't been able to break through the surface. If what you're saying about ReedCap holds, and if the trading pattern maps the way you're describing, she's going to want to see this. What I give her needs to come through an anonymous channel. Nothing that ties back to me, nothing that ties back to Ethan directly." Roz looked at her steadily. "This is going to blow up his company." "I know. And his career. I know." A pause that held several things Roz didn't say. "And you're telling me you're ready for that." Selena looked at her across the table. Outside the window, London moved past in its usual relentless way. People, vehicles, weather, the city's constant indifferent momentum. She thought about the place card, sitting on a table in a ballroom full of people who hadn't noticed it. She thought about Ethan's face that morning in the kitchen, the quick, careful shift in his expression when she'd said place card. She thought about a woman who had spent 3 years getting smaller, and about the work that had always known how to make her feel large again. "I've been ready for a while," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." Roz studied her a moment longer. Then she nodded. She picked up her phone and started making arrangements. Roz Hart worked the way Selena remembered, quietly, without drama, with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that the most effective version of any important action was the one that made the least noise on its way to the outcome. She didn't promise timelines. She didn't speculate about how far things might go. She said she would make contact with the journalist, a woman named Claire Ashworth at the Herald, and that she would let Selena know when there was something to know. That was a Wednesday. By Friday, Selena had her answer. The text came through at 11 in the morning while she was standing in the kitchen in her bathrobe waiting for the coffee to finish. Claire wants to meet. She's serious. Are you ready to share the documentation? Selena looked at the message for a long moment. Through the window, the city was going about its business. Low gray November sky, the sound of traffic several floors down, a pigeon working at something on the ledge across the way. She thought about readiness, about what that word actually meant when applied to something you couldn't take back. She typed, "Yes. Tell me when and where." She met Claire Ashworth the following Monday at a members club in Fitzrovia that Roz used for this kind of meeting. Private enough that conversations didn't carry, public enough that two women sharing documents over coffee didn't register as anything unusual. Claire was younger than Selena had expected, mid-30s, with the slightly compressed energy of someone who was perpetually managing more threads than she could comfortably hold. She had a notebook that she kept closed for the first 20 minutes of their conversation, which Selena took as a sign of professional discipline. "How long have you been watching Nixora?" Selena asked. "Seriously? About 8 months." Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "We had a source inside, mid-level finance team, who flagged some internal budgeting anomalies back in the spring, but the sourcing was too thin to move on, and then the source went quiet." "What kind of anomalies?" "Expense categorizations that didn't match the service descriptions. Vendor payments with no corresponding contracts on file. The usual fingerprints." She paused. "What Roz is telling me you have is different." "It's the same picture from the outside," Selena said. "But from the outside, the shapes are clearer. When you're inside a company, you're looking at pieces. From the public filings, you can see how the pieces connect." Claire studied her. "And you found ReadCap and the trading pattern and the subsidiary structure." "Yes." "You're going to walk me through all of it." "That's why I'm here." Claire finally opened her notebook. They spent 3 hours at that table. Selena had printed nothing. She was too careful for that. And besides, paper trails had a way of developing their own momentum once they left your hands. Instead, she talked Claire through the structure, the logic, the sequence of disclosures, and the pattern of behavior that, when mapped chronologically, built an argument that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Claire asked sharp questions. She pushed back on 2 of Selena's interpretations, and Selena pushed back on the pushbacks. And by the end, they had reached a working understanding of what the evidence actually supported and what it only suggested. "What I can verify independently," Claire said, reviewing her notes, "is the trading pattern. The Form 4s are public. I can get someone to model the statistical correlation between her disposals and the earnings announcements. If the probability math supports what you're describing, that's publishable on its own. It's more compelling with ReadCap." "I know, but ReadCap needs more sourcing before I can put it in print. I can't publish allegations against a named individual based on a connection trace alone, even a strong one." Selena nodded. She'd expected this. "What would you need?" "A second source. Someone who can confirm the relationship between Reed and the consulting entity from the inside, or financial records that establish the ownership link more directly than a co-signed property filing." "Give me some time on that." Claire looked at her. "How much time?" "I don't know yet. But the trading pattern story, run that. Run that as soon as your analysis is solid. Don't wait for ReadCap. The trading pattern alone is enough to put pressure on the company." Claire was quiet for a moment. She closed her notebook. "I want to understand something," she said. "Not for the story. Just for my own clarity." She paused. "You're married to a senior employee at this company." "Yes." "And you're the one who brought this to us." "Yes." "That's not a comfortable position." Selena picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. "No," she said. "It isn't." The week after the meeting with Claire was the strangest of all the strange weeks that had accumulated since the gala. On the surface, nothing had changed. Ethan went to work. He came home. They ate dinner together 3 out of 5 nights, which was about average for the past 2 years. He had spoken to Cassandra about the place card. He mentioned this on a Tuesday evening briefly in the hallway with the slightly clipped tone of someone delivering a report they'd rather not be delivering. "She denied it," he said. Selena looked at him. "Okay." "She said she didn't write it. She said she doesn't know where it came from." He loosened his tie, not looking at her. I told her it was unacceptable regardless. What did she say to that? She said she agreed and that she'd look into it. He dropped the tie on the hall table. I know it's not satisfying, but I'm not sure what else I can do. Selena watched him. She thought about the handwriting. She thought about the quality of his discomfort. Not the discomfort of a man who was angry on his wife's behalf, but something more specific. Something that looked, to a trained eye, like a person managing information they hadn't decided what to do with yet. It's fine, she said. He finally looked at her. Are you sure? Because I've been what? A beat. Quiet. Since the gala. You've seemed, I don't know, somewhere else. I've been working. On what? She held his eyes for a moment. Some old cases, background research. I'm thinking about going back to it. Consulting work, at least. I've been out of it too long. Something moved across his face. She couldn't tell if it was relief or unease or the particular expression of a person who's just heard something they should pay closer attention to but have decided, for reasons of their own, not to. Yeah, that could be good. He nodded slowly. Yeah. He went to change out of his work clothes. She went to the office and sat down in front of her laptop and spent the next 2 hours trying to find a second sourcing thread on ReadCap that didn't require access to records she didn't legally have. She found it ultimately not through the records but through a person. His name was Daniel Price, and he had worked in Nexora's finance team for 4 years before leaving abruptly 18 months ago. Selena found him through a combination of LinkedIn archaeology and a mutual contact from her Canary Wharf days, who remembered him from an industry event. He was now working for a smaller firm in Birmingham and was, by the account of the mutual contact, not especially happy about how things ended at Nexora. She messaged him directly, keeping it brief and professional. She introduced herself using her maiden name rather than Cross, described herself accurately as a financial analyst, and said she was conducting background research on several financial services companies, and wondered if he'd be willing to have a brief conversation about his experience in the sector. It was technically true. All of it. He responded within 6 hours. He was cautious at first. She'd expected that. But he agreed to a phone call, and on the call she asked careful, circling questions that gradually moved toward the specific without ever arriving there prematurely. She asked about the culture at the company. She asked about the finance team's relationship with senior leadership. She asked, eventually, about vendor management processes and whether the company's accounting practices had been a source of any internal discussion or concern during his time there. The silence that followed that last question was about 4 seconds long. I signed an NDA when I left, he said. I understand that, she said. I'm not asking you to violate anything. I'm asking whether, as a general matter, the kind of processes you observed were consistent with what you'd seen elsewhere in the sector. Another pause. No, he said. They weren't. Was that a concern you raised internally? I raised some questions, yes. And how were those received? I left 18 months ago, he said. Which was not an answer, but was, in its own way, entirely an answer. She thanked him. She asked if she could stay in touch. He said he'd think about it, which she'd learned over years of this work meant yes, but I need to be careful how. She sent Roz a message that night. Found a second source. Not confirmed yet, but close. Tell Claire to hold on ReadCap for 2 weeks. Roz replied, She won't wait longer than that. She won't need to, Selena wrote back. In the apartment, in the evenings, she and Ethan continued to occupy the same space in the way of two people who have long since stopped being careful about distance because they've stopped noticing it. They watched television sometimes. They talked about logistics, groceries, a boiler service that needed scheduling, a dinner with Ethan's university friend that was supposed to happen in December. The conversations were functional and not unkind. There were moments, occasional ones, where it almost felt like it used to feel, where he said something that made her laugh, or she brought him tea without being asked and he looked up with something that was genuinely warm. Those moments were the worst ones, not because they were painful in an obvious way, but because they were the moments when she could see exactly what this had been and exactly what had happened to it, and how the two things were connected in ways that didn't leave room for simple explanations. It had been real. She was fairly certain of that. She was not someone who had imagined the first years, The way he used to ask about her cases with genuine curiosity. The way they'd spend Sunday mornings in bed with coffee and the papers and talk about everything and nothing. The way she'd felt, for a period that now seemed both very long ago and very specific, like someone who was both fully known and fully chosen. She didn't know exactly when it had changed. That was the part that wouldn't resolve cleanly, the part she'd find herself circling at 2 in the morning when the work was done and the apartment was quiet. It wasn't one event. It wasn't even a series of clear events. It was more like the way ice forms, gradually, at edges first, then spreading inward, until one day you look down and realize the surface that used to move has been frozen for some time, and you don't remember watching it happen. The place card hadn't caused this. She knew that. It had only made it visible. Claire Ashworth published the trading pattern analysis on a Thursday morning, 14 days after their meeting in Fitzrovia. Selena saw it on her phone at 7:42 while Ethan was still in the shower. The headline was measured, questions raised over Nexora executives' share timing, but the content was not. Claire and her team had run the statistical analysis, confirmed the correlation between Cassandra's disposal pattern and the earnings announcements, and sourced 2 market analysts who provided on-record commentary about how unusual the pattern was. She hadn't named insider trading directly. She didn't need to. The piece let the numbers do the work. Selena put her phone face down on the kitchen counter and made coffee. Ethan came out of the bedroom 20 minutes later, already checking his own phone, already wearing the expression of someone absorbing bad news in real time. He didn't say anything for a moment. He stood in the kitchen doorway reading, and she watched the color shift slightly in his face. Not dramatic, but there. The specific pallor of a person whose circumstances have just changed faster than their understanding of them. "There's an article," he said. "I know." He looked up. "You've seen it?" "I saw the headline." He looked back down at his phone. "It's about Cassandra, the share sales." He was quiet for another moment. This is going to be a problem." "Probably." He looked at her again, and something in the way she'd said that, the evenness of it, the absence of surprise, seemed to register in a way he wasn't immediately sure what to do with. She watched him decide not to address it directly. She watched him choose the more immediate crisis instead. "I need to call the office," he said. "Okay." He picked up his coffee and went back to the bedroom. She heard his voice through the wall, low, controlled, the professional register he used when he was managing something. She heard Cassandra's name. She heard the word legal. She finished her coffee and washed the mug and went to the office. She had work to do. The week that followed the Herald article was, in the world outside their apartment, a controlled emergency. Nexora's stock dropped 6% the morning the piece published, recovered partially by midday, then lost ground again as 2 other financial outlets picked up the story and added commentary. Cassandra's communications team issued a statement through the company's PR office describing the trades as part of a pre-scheduled disposal plan and the reporting as misleading and without factual basis. The statement was careful and well-constructed, and Selena thought, written by someone who knew exactly what the actual exposure was and was trying to shape the story before it got away from them. It was too late for that. The story was already walking on its own. At Nexora's offices, she gathered from what Ethan brought home in small fragments, a phrase here, a tension there, the specific brand of exhaustion that settles into a person when their workplace has become a place they dread. That the executive team was meeting constantly and speaking carefully and doing the thing that organizations under pressure do, which is to be very deliberate about who says what and to whom. Cassandra, by Ethan's account, was composed. She was in the building every day. She was holding her team together with the particular force of personality that had always been her primary instrument. "She's not worried," Ethan said one evening, in the careful tone of a person who is trying to convince himself as much as the person he's speaking to. "She says this kind of press happens with companies at Nexora's stage. It'll pass." Selena looked at him across the dinner table. "Do you believe her?" He moved food around his plate. "She's been right about most things." "That's not what I asked." A pause. He put his fork down. "I don't know, Selena. I genuinely don't know. The trading pattern thing is—" He stopped, picked his fork back up. "The legal team says it's defensible." "I'm sure they do. He gave her a look then, something between tired and sharp. You seem very calm about this. Should I not be? My career is in a company that's currently under press scrutiny. Our finances are... Your finances, she said. Quietly. Not unkind, but precise. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it. She watched him decide again, not to follow that thread where it led. I just meant, he said, that this affects both of us. I know. She stood and took her plate to the kitchen. Daniel Price called her back on a Saturday morning. She was alone in the apartment. Ethan had gone to meet a colleague for lunch, something that had been scheduled before the Herald piece, and that she suspected he'd kept partly to have somewhere to be outside the apartment's accumulating tension. She was at her desk when the call came through, and she answered on the second ring. I've been thinking about your questions, Daniel said without preamble. Take your time. The NDAI signed covers internal operational information, specific documents, specific processes. He paused. It doesn't cover what I personally observed in general terms. That's not protected. I understand. Another pause. She could hear him working through whatever he was working through. She didn't rush it. There was a vendor, he said eventually. We called it the advisory contract internally. Finance team, we all knew about it. The payments were large and they went out quarterly, very regular, and whenever anyone asked what services were actually being rendered, the answer was always strategic consultation, no specifics, no deliverables, no reporting relationship. Did you try to escalate that? I flagged it in an internal audit review. I wrote it up as a potential compliance concern. A pause. The week after I submitted that review, my manager called me in and told me my role was being restructured. I was offered a package. I took it. Selena was quiet for a moment. I appreciate you telling me this. I'm not giving you documents, he said. I don't have them anyway. My access was revoked the week I submitted the review. But what I've just told you is what I saw and what happened to me, and that's mine to say. It is. What are you going to do with it? She thought about Claire Ashworth, about the notebook, about the timeline they'd been working toward. Put it somewhere it can be useful, she said. She met Roz for the second time at a different cafe, this one in Southwark, a week after the Price call. She relayed what he'd told her, not verbatim, just the shape of it, the structural confirmation it provided. Roz listened with the same stillness as before and then said, Claire's been working on the subsidiary angle independently. She found a registered agent in Jersey who lists ReadCap as an active entity as of this year. She also found a beneficial ownership disclosure that was filed incorrectly, the kind of filing error that looks like a mistake but that, in Cassandra's position, is hard to explain as innocent. Incorrectly how? The wrong name in the ultimate beneficial owner field, a name that matches neither Margaret Hollis nor Cassandra Reed, but that Claire's team traced to a third party with demonstrable financial connections to Reed going back 7 years. Selena sat with that. She's been layering it. Carefully, but not carefully enough, apparently. When does Claire publish? Rose picked up her coffee. She's talking to her editor this week. If everything passes legal review, she's looking at 10 days. 10 days. Selena thought about the apartment, about Ethan coming home every evening with a little more weight on him, a little less of whatever it was that had once made him easy to be in a room with. She thought about Jeffrey Marsh standing in the lobby of Claridge's hotel with his phone and his slightly vague expression, receiving her warning and probably spending the subsequent weeks trying to figure out what to do with it. There's something else, Roz said. She said it carefully, in the tone she used when she had information she was uncertain how to deliver. Selena looked at her. Claire's source inside the company, the one who went quiet in the spring. She reached out to Claire again 2 weeks ago, after the first article. Okay. She's in the executive support team. She was there when the gala seating was arranged. Roz paused. She says Cassandra organized the place cards personally. She was in the office the afternoon before the event. The source saw the card, your card, on Cassandra's desk before it was placed. The cafe around them continued at its normal volume. A man at the next table was on a phone call about a plumbing quote. A woman near the window was laughing at something on her laptop. Selena heard all of it, and none of it. "There's more," Roz said, and her voice had dropped very slightly in the way of someone who has learned to deliver certain kinds of information in measured pieces. "Tell me." "The source says Ethan was in Cassandra's office that afternoon." A beat. "She doesn't know what was said," Roz continued. "She wasn't in the room, but she saw him go in, and she saw him leave. And when she went in later to collect the seating chart, the card for your place was still on Cassandra's desk where she'd left it." Selena looked at her water glass. She looked at the condensation on the outside of it. She thought about a Tuesday evening in a hallway, a loosened tie, the specific quality of Ethan's discomfort when she'd said the words place card. She denied it. She said she didn't know where it came from. She thought about the 4-second silence on a phone call with Daniel Price when she asked about internal concerns being raised. The way a pause could contain an entire answer without words. She thought about Ethan's face when she'd asked him directly, "Did you see the place card?" The small, quick shift. "Does the source know whether Ethan saw it?" she asked. Roz held her eyes. "She thinks so. She can't be certain, but she thinks so." The cafe continued around them. The plumbing call had ended. The woman by the window was still laughing. Selena picked up her coffee and finished it. She set the cup down with a small, precise sound. "All right," she said. She didn't say anything else for a while. Roz, to her considerable credit, didn't push. She went home that afternoon and she sat in the office for a long time without the laptop open. Just sat with the window in front of her and the city beyond it, the same city she'd been looking at for weeks, and she let herself think the thought she'd been constructing a careful detour around for the past 10 days. Ethan had known. Not certainly. She was too careful a thinker to land on certainty with one source who hadn't been in the room, but probably. Probably he had stood in Cassandra's office that afternoon and seen the card with his wife's name on it and the words underneath, and he had made a calculation. Whatever the calculation was, keep Cassandra happy, pick his career over his marriage, decide it wasn't his place to interfere with his boss's choices. He had made it. He had gone to the gala. He had laughed at her jokes. He had stood in a ballroom full of people and watched Selena sit down at table 7 and not said a word. She sat with that for a long time. Outside the window, the November afternoon was darkening early, the way it did this time of year. 4 o'clock, and the sky was already going to charcoal, the lights of the city coming up one by one below her. She used to find that beautiful. She still found it beautiful. That surprised her slightly, that she was capable of finding it beautiful right now. She thought about the woman she'd been 10 years ago, sitting in conference rooms with a stack of filings, and the absolute certainty that somewhere in the numbers there was a truth waiting to be found. She had always loved that part, not the exposure of wrongdoing exactly, not the consequence, but the finding. The moment when the picture emerged from the data, the moment when what had been hidden became visible and could not become hidden again. She thought, "I know who I am." She'd had that thought at the bathroom mirror before the gala, and she'd put it away because the timing seemed strange. But it hadn't been strange. It had been the most precise and accurate thought she'd had in several years, arriving exactly when it was supposed to. She opened her laptop. She had work to do, and the story she'd spent 3 weeks building was 10 days from becoming public, and there were still pieces to move and choices to make, and she was the person who knew how to make them. She started to type. The 10 days passed the way time passes when you are waiting for something irreversible. Not slowly exactly, but with a specific texture, each hour slightly thicker than normal, each ordinary moment carrying a weight it wouldn't carry otherwise. Selena went through them with the discipline she'd developed over weeks of this work. Methodical, focused, doing the next thing that needed doing and not spending energy on the things she couldn't yet control. She called Daniel Price twice more. Not to push him further than he'd already gone, but to keep the line warm, to let him know that what he'd shared had mattered and that the way it would be used was being handled carefully. He appreciated that, she could tell. The careful handling was the thing he'd needed reassurance about before he'd said anything at all. On the second call, he mentioned, without her asking, that there had been 2 other people in the finance team who'd raised similar concerns in the year before he left. He didn't give her names. She didn't ask for them. But she noted it. She also called Douglas, her former manager at the fraud investigation firm, was the kind of man who communicated primarily through silences of varying quality. And when she told him, briefly, without detail, the way you brief someone you trust rather than someone you're trying to convince, that she was doing financial research that might be moving towards something significant, the silence she got in return was the kind that meant he was genuinely interested. "Are you looking for a way back in?" he asked. "I'm looking to finish something first." "And after that?" She thought about it honestly. "Probably yes." Another silence, this one warmer. "I'm not filling your old role, but there are others. Come talk to me when you're done with whatever this is." She said she would. She meant it. 18. Claire Ashworth's second article published on a Wednesday, 9 days after Selena's meeting with Rose in Southwark. The headline this time was not measured. It read, "Nixora's Hidden Millions, the consulting contract that wasn't." The subhead named ReadCap Advisory and described the Channel Islands registration, the beneficial ownership discrepancy, and the pattern of payments from Nixora's operational accounts over a 3-year period. It included a quote from a former finance team employee, unnamed, described only as a former senior analyst, confirming the existence of an internal compliance concern that had been suppressed rather than investigated. It also included a statement from the Financial Conduct Authority confirming that they were reviewing trading activity in Nixora shares over the preceding 3-year period. That last line was the one that mattered. Selena read the article at her desk at 7 in the morning while the apartment was still quiet. She read it twice. She checked the sourcing, the accuracy of the structural description, the care with which Claire had drawn the line between what was demonstrated and what was alleged. It was good work. Claire had been thorough and she'd been fair, which in Selena's experience was a rarer combination than it should have been. She closed the laptop and sat very still for a moment. Then she went and made coffee, and she was standing at the kitchen counter when Ethan came out of the bedroom. He was already holding his phone. His face had a quality she hadn't seen before, not the controlled worry of the past 2 weeks, not the managed professional anxiety of a man whose company was having a difficult news cycle. This was something raw. He looked, standing in the kitchen doorway in his work shirt with his phone in his hand, like a person who had just understood something they'd been avoiding understanding. "They named ReadCap," he said. "I know. The FCA is reviewing trades." He put his phone down on the counter, picked it up again. This isn't press coverage anymore, Selena. This is a regulatory investigation." "Yes." He looked at her. "You don't seem surprised." She held his eyes and didn't say anything. Something moved across his face. She'd been watching his face for 7 years, and she could read it with reasonable accuracy, and what she saw now was not simple. It was a man doing rapid, uncomfortable arithmetic, adding things up that he'd been keeping in separate columns. "I need to get to the office," he said. "Okay." He picked up his keys. He stopped in the hallway and turned back. "We need to talk, tonight, properly." "We do," she agreed. He left. She heard the door. She stood in the kitchen for another minute, then put her mug in the sink and went back to the office because there were still things that needed doing and the day had, in a significant sense, just begun. What happened at Nixora's offices that Wednesday was something she pieced together later through Ethan's fragmented account, through Claire's subsequent reporting, and through the particular texture of the phone calls she could hear through the office wall whenever Ethan stepped out of the bedroom to take them privately. The executive team convened at 8 that morning in the main conference room on the 14th floor. Cassandra was there. So was the head of legal, the CFO, 2 board members who'd come in from outside, and Jeffrey Marsh, who by all subsequent accounts spent most of the meeting saying very little and listening with the expression of a man rapidly revising his understanding of the organization he was supposed to be leading. Cassandra's position, as relayed secondhand and in pieces, was that the article was inaccurate, that ReadCap was a legitimate consulting entity with documented services rendered, and that the beneficial ownership filing discrepancy was an administrative error that would be corrected. She was composed. She held the room with the same force she'd always used. Several people in that room had worked for her for years and were predisposed to believe her, and belief once established doesn't dissolve the moment a newspaper article contradicts it. But the FCA statement was different. The FCA statement was not a newspaper article. It could not be characterized as misleading or hostile or driven by competitive interest. It was a regulatory body confirming, in the specific careful language of official bodies, that they were looking. And when regulators look, companies change shape. The people who were certain become uncertain. The people who were silent start calculating the cost of continued silence. And the structure that held because everyone agreed to hold it begins to show the places where it was always thin. Ethan came home that evening looking like he'd aged slightly in a specific concentrated way, the way some days managed to do. He dropped his bag in the hallway and sat down on the couch without taking his coat off and looked at the middle distance. Selena came and sat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The apartment was quiet around them, the particular quiet of a space that has held a version of two people's life together and is now holding something different, something that hasn't been named yet but is present in the air. Legal advised everyone to limit communication, Ethan said, to the middle distance. About the investigation, about anything related to the recap reporting. They said to assume all internal communications are potentially discoverable. That's standard advice, Selena said. I know it's standard. He finally looked at her. I know that. I've been around enough corporate legal situations to know that. It doesn't make sitting in that room today feel less like... He stopped, like the floor has opened up. She looked at him steadily. Ethan. What? Did you know? About recap. About the payments. His jaw tightened slightly. Selena, I'm asking you directly. Did you know what Cassandra was doing? A pause. She watched him decide, and she watched him decide carefully, in the way of a person who understands that what they say in the next 30 seconds is going to matter in ways that can't be taken back. I knew there was a consulting contract, he said. I didn't know the details. I'm in product. The financial structure of the company's vendor relationships isn't... That's not my area. But you knew something was irregular. He looked at his hands. I had questions. Yes. I chose not to ask them out loud. He said the last part quietly, in the tone of a person who is not trying to defend a choice, but simply to be accurate about it. She nodded. She let the honesty of that sit for a moment without piling onto it. And the place card, she said. He went still. I know you were in Cassandra's office the afternoon before the gala, she said. I know the card was on her desk. I'm asking you to tell me what happened. The silence that followed was a different quality from any of the silences that had come before in this apartment, in this marriage. It was the silence of the last wall coming down, not with a crash, but with a kind of exhausted inevitability, the way things fall when they've been leaning for too long. I saw it, he said. She held very still. I saw it on her desk. She wasn't in the room. I'd gone in to drop off a document, and I read it. He stopped. His voice had gone flat in the particular way of someone keeping emotion out of what they're saying through direct effort. And I walked out. You walked out. Yes. And you didn't say anything to her? No. And you didn't tell me? No. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and she could see what it cost him. Not the admission itself, but the exposure of it. The fact of being seen clearly in a moment of deliberate failure with no available explanation that made it better. Why? She asked. Not angrily, just because she genuinely needed to understand the architecture of it. He let out a slow breath. Because she's my boss. Because I've spent 7 years building something at that company and she controls whether it keeps existing. Because He stopped, tried again. Because I told myself it was just a stupid card, that it wouldn't even register, that you'd sit down, have dinner, come home, and it would just be a non-event. You thought I wouldn't notice. I thought... Another stop. I don't know what I thought. I think I didn't want to have to choose. And choosing nothing felt like not choosing. He pressed his hands flat on his knees. I know how that sounds. It sounds like what it is, she said. He didn't answer that. There wasn't a good answer. She didn't sleep well that night. Not badly, exactly, just lightly. She was aware of the ceiling above her and the shape of Ethan's breathing next to her, and the city outside doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous. She lay there and she thought about 7 years, about the Hargrove case and the parking garage and the 45 seconds before the dinner conversation pivoted. About Edinburgh. About the 100 small accommodations she'd made and told herself were choices, because calling them choices made her feel like a person with agency rather than a person losing ground. She thought about what he'd said. I didn't want to have to choose. She understood it, which was the uncomfortable part. She didn't excuse it. The not choosing was still a choice, and it was a choice he'd made at her expense, and that was real and wouldn't become less real. But she understood the mechanism of it, the way a person who is building something and is afraid of losing it will do nearly anything to avoid the moment of conflict that might end it. She had done her own version of it, not the same version, not in a way that had ever hurt him directly, but she had made choices to preserve the surface of things when she should have said, "This isn't working," and meant it. They had both been cowards, in different ways, for a long time. The difference was that she had finally stopped. The FCA's investigation became public knowledge. Thursday, the day after Claire's article, when Nexora released a mandatory regulatory disclosure confirming they had received a formal inquiry and were cooperating with the review. The stock fell 11% by noon. By late afternoon, it had fallen 14%. Financial outlets were running the story continuously. The Herald's original reporting, the trading pattern analysis, the recap disclosure, and now the regulatory confirmation, all compounding each other into a narrative that moved with its own velocity. Selena watched this from her desk with a feeling she found difficult to categorize. It was not triumph. She'd expected something closer to triumph and found instead something more complicated, a kind of heavy satisfaction, the feeling of a thing that needed to be true finally becoming true, mixed with a clear-eyed awareness of the damage moving outward from it, like rings in water. She was not sorry for the damage in the direction of Cassandra Reed. She was not entirely sorry for it in the direction of Nexora's shareholders, who were now finding out what their investment had actually been built on. But there were people in that building who had done nothing except work there, and she was not immune to the reality of what they were now facing. That was the thing about this kind of work. You couldn't be surgical enough to protect everyone. You could only be honest about the cost and conclude that the alternative, the continued deception, the ongoing harm to investors, the structural rot of a company built on lies, was worse. She'd reached that conclusion weeks ago. She'd reached it sitting at her desk at 3 a.m. with her shoes off and her tea cold, and she'd reached it clearly, and she hadn't changed her mind. But she let herself feel the weight of it anyway. That seemed important. The call she'd been half expecting came Friday morning. Not from the FCA, not from any journalist, not from anyone connected to Nexora. It came from a number she recognized, the direct line of a woman named Harriet Voss, who ran the investments division at Caldwell Meridian, one of the larger independent investment management firms in London. Selena had met Harriet Voss exactly once, at an industry conference 4 years ago, in the awkward transitional period between her old career and whatever her life at that point had become. They'd talked for about 20 minutes at a drinks reception, and Harriet had given her a card and said, with the directness of a woman who did not specialize in pleasantries, that if Selena ever decided to come back to serious financial analysis, she should call. Selena had kept the card in the drawer of her desk for 4 years. She had looked at it several times. She had not called. She answered on the third ring. "Harriet," she said. "Selena." A pause, and in it she could hear Harriet deciding how direct to be and concluding, correctly, that direct was the right choice. "I've been following the Nexora situation with considerable interest. I imagine a lot of people have. The recap analysis in the Herald is unusually well constructed. The subsidiary tracing and the beneficial ownership thread, that's not standard financial journalism. That's forensic analysis. It reads like it came from someone who's done serious investigative work." Selena said nothing. "I'm not asking you to confirm anything," Harriet said. "I'm not calling about Nexora specifically. I'm calling because a position opened up in my team 3 weeks ago, and I haven't filled it yet because the right person hasn't presented themselves." A brief pause. The right person is someone who can build a case from public data, who understands how financial structures are assembled and how they come apart, and who is not easily impressed by the surface presentation of companies that have invested heavily in their surface presentation. That's a specific skill. It's not common. Selena looked at the wall above her desk, at the framed print Ethan had bought at a market in Portobello 2 years ago, that she'd never particularly liked, but had never said so. "What's the role?" she asked. Harriet told her. Head of Research Integrity, Caldwell Meridian's Investment Analysis Division. A team of 6. Oversight of due diligence on major positions. Freedom to develop the function in whatever direction Selina determined was needed. A compensation package she named without hesitation in the way of a person who had already decided the number before making the call. "I'd want to meet," Selina said. "Of course. I'm thinking early next week, if that works." "It works?" She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she put it face down on the desk and went back to the Nixora filing she'd had open, because there was still work to finish, and she intended to finish it before she thought about what came after. The raid happened the following Tuesday. She didn't know it was happening while it was happening. She was in Harriet Voss's office on the 3rd floor of Caldwell Meridian's building in St. James's, drinking decent coffee and talking through the specifics of the role with the focused attention of a woman who had remembered, over the past 3 weeks, what it felt like to be in a room where her actual capabilities were the thing being discussed. Harriet was direct and occasionally blunt, and clearly brilliant in the particular way of people who have spent 30 years being right about things other people got wrong. Selina found her bracing. That was the right word. Not comfortable exactly, but bracing, the way clean cold air is bracing after too long in a room with the windows shut. They talked for 2 hours. Harriet asked hard questions about Selina's methodology, and Selina answered them honestly, including answering "I don't know" in 2 instances where that was the accurate response, which seemed to satisfy Harriet more than a confident wrong answer would have. By the end of the meeting, it was clear to both of them that the role was going to be offered and the offer was going to be accepted, but neither of them rushed toward that conclusion because some things are better handled with appropriate pace. She was in a cab on the way home when she checked her phone and saw the news alerts. The FCA had executed a formal search warrant on Nixora Systems' London offices. 4 investigators and 2 financial crime specialists had arrived at the building at 9:45 that morning and spent 6 hours reviewing and copying documents. The warrant covered executive communications, financial records, and vendor contract documentation for a 39-month period. Cassandra Reed had been escorted to a separate room for voluntary questioning. The company's external lawyers had been on site within the hour. The stock had suspended trading at 11 a.m. Selina put her phone in her bag. She looked out the cab window at London in the early December afternoon. Low winter light, Christmas decorations on the storefronts, the particular quality of a city in a season. She thought about a ballroom and a place card, and the feeling of walking through a crowd of people who didn't see her toward a pair of doors and the cold air outside them. Ethan called as the cab turned into their street. She let it ring twice, then answered. "You've seen," he said. Not a question. "Yes." They were in the building all day. His voice was hollow in a way that had nothing to do with the connection. Cassandra was pulled into a room. Nobody knows what she told them. Legal is saying nobody should talk to each other about it. That's sensible advice. "Selina." A pause. "I need to talk to you about something." She paid the driver, got out, stood on the pavement in front of their building. "I'm outside. I'll be up in a minute." "Okay." She stood there for a moment in the cold, her bag over her shoulder, looking up at the building. Their windows were 2 floors up, and she could see the light on in the living room, which meant Ethan was home early, which made sense given what the day had been. She stood there and she thought, not for the last time, about the gap between what a life looks like from the outside and what it is on the inside, and about all the ways a person can spend years not looking at that gap directly, because looking at it directly requires decisions. She went inside. He was sitting on this couch, not in the middle of it, but at the end, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He'd taken off his jacket and tie, and he looked exhausted in a bone-deep way that she recognized. It was the exhaustion of a day in which the things you'd been managing to keep apart had finally met each other. She sat down. Not across from him this time, but at the other end of the couch. She set her bag on the floor. "Legal called me at 4, he said. "Individual counsel. They want me to have my own representation separate from the company. They said it was standard practice given the scope of the investigation." "It is," she said. "It means they're looking at individuals, not just the entity." I know what it means. He pressed his hands together. I have a meeting with a solicitor tomorrow morning. They're already on retainer for situations like this, apparently. A dry, tired sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I didn't know that was a service our company provided until today. What are you worried about specifically? He looked at her. That they'll ask what I knew and when, and that whatever I say is either incriminating or useless. What did you know and when? I told you. The vendor questions, the informal knowledge, nothing that rises to the level of, Ethan, she kept her voice even, talk to the solicitor before you talk to anyone else about specifics, including me. That's not me putting distance between us. That's me telling you the right process. He absorbed that. Right. A pause. You sound like a fraud investigator. I was one. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in the way he hadn't in a long time, in the way that had become infrequent enough that she'd stopped expecting it. She saw him see her, not the version of her that had been present in this apartment for the past several years, the managed version, the accommodated version, the version that had learned to take up less space, but something closer to the actual her, the one who had gone to a meeting that morning and told a senior financial executive exactly how she thought investigative analysis should be structured and why. You've been working this whole time, he said quietly. Since the gala, haven't you? She didn't confirm or deny it. She just held his eyes. The Herald articles. He said it slowly, working through it. The structure of the reporting, the recap thread. He stopped. Selena. You should talk to your solicitor, she said. Before you say anything else, that's genuinely the right advice. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling. He stayed like that for a long moment, and she watched his face do the work of absorbing something that had multiple layers and couldn't be absorbed quickly. When he looked back at her, he looked like a man who had understood something and was deciding how to feel about it, and hadn't decided yet. I'm not going to pretend I'm not... He stopped. I don't know what I am right now. I need to think. That's fair, she said. Are you... Another stop. He looked at his hands. Are we okay? She looked at him. The honest answer to that question was not simple, and she owed him the real version rather than the comfortable one. No, she said. I don't think we are. He nodded slowly. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man hearing something confirmed that he had known for a while and had been finding ways not to say. The place card, he said. It's not just the place card. I know. He said it quietly. I know it's not. The room was quiet around them. Outside, the city continued. Sirens somewhere in the distance, the muffled sound of traffic, someone's television in the flat above them. All the ordinary sounds of a life that was going to be very different from this point forward, though neither of them had said so yet in terms that made it final. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She went to the kitchen and ran the tap for a moment, for no reason, just to be doing something with her hands. I have a meeting on Monday, she said, without turning around. About a job. A real one. She heard him shift on the couch. The financial firm? Yes. A pause. Good, he said, and then, with an effort she could hear clearly, even from the other room. That's good, Selena. You should do it. She turned off the tap. She stood at the counter for a moment. She thought about all the things that were still ahead. The solicitors, the decisions, the conversations that would need to be had carefully and in their proper order. She thought about Harriet Voss and the office on the third floor. She thought about Douglas and the phone call and the word, probably. She thought about the shape of a case coming into focus the way it always did, slowly and then all at once. She thought about the moment she'd walked out of a ballroom in November and whispered 4 words to a man who hadn't known her name. She thought about how long before that moment the real choice had actually been made, and how much of life was just the distance between making a choice and being willing to act on it. She went to the office. She closed the door behind her, not hard, just closed. She sat down. She opened her laptop. 3 floors down and outside on the street, the city moved past in the dark, not knowing or caring that something had ended in an apartment above it, or that the woman at the lit window was already thinking about what came next. The Monday meeting with Harriet Voss lasted 40 minutes and ended with a formal offer letter delivered by email before Selena had reached the tube station. She read it standing on the platform with her coat still on, the draft blowing in from the tunnel, commuters moving around her in the particular purposeful stream of a London Monday morning. The terms were as discussed. The start date was flexible. The role was real. She accepted it that evening. She typed the response at her desk in the office. The same desk where she'd spent the past 6 weeks rebuilding something she'd let go dormant, and she sent it without rereading it 3 times, which was how she knew she was certain. Ethan was in the living room when she came out. He'd been different since their conversation on the couch, quieter, more careful, occupying the apartment with a kind of deliberate consideration that reminded her of someone walking on a surface they're not sure will hold. He'd met with the solicitor Saturday morning and come back with the compressed inward expression of a person who has been told precisely how serious their situation is by someone whose professional purpose is to be accurate about that. She told him about the job offer. He looked up from whatever he'd been not really reading. "You accepted?" "Yes." He nodded. He looked back down, then up again. "When do you start?" "Second week of January. They wanted sooner, but I said I needed the time." "For what?" She held his eye. "To sort things out." He understood what that meant. She could see it move through him. The understanding and the something else underneath it. The something that was grief, or regret, or possibly both, sitting next to each other, the way those two things often do. "Okay," he said. It was not enough of a conversation. They both knew it, and neither of them was ready to have the full version yet. So they let the smaller one stand in its place for the time being and went to their separate corners of the apartment and let the evening pass in its quiet, loaded way. Cassandra Reed was arrested on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the raid. Selena found out from Claire, who texted at 7:51. "It's happening. FCA and SFO joint operation. She's been taken in for questioning under caution. Formal charges expected within 48 hours. I wanted you to know before the news cycle picks it up." Selena read the message sitting at her kitchen counter with her coffee. She read it again. She put the phone down. She thought about a woman in an ivory gown standing in a ballroom, receiving Ethan Cross the way people receive things they expected. She thought about a handwriting style, the wide looping capitals, the aggressive underline. She thought about a place card that had been, in its own way, the most honest communication Cassandra had ever directed toward her. "Here is what I think of you. Here is what you are to me. Here is how little I imagine you can do about it." She thought about being wrong, about the particular cost of badly underestimating the capabilities of a person you've written off. She did not feel sorry for Cassandra Reed. She'd examined that question honestly, several times, in the way she tried to examine all important questions, and she'd come back to the same place each time. What Cassandra had done, the financial deception, the investor harm, the deliberate suppression of internal concerns, the culture of contempt she'd built and maintained over years, was serious and it was real, and the consequences it was now generating were proportionate. She did not feel the need to perform sympathy she didn't have. But she also didn't feel the rush of satisfaction she'd half expected. That wasn't how it worked. She'd learned this before. Cases that resolved correctly didn't feel like victories. They felt like the end of a sustained effort, like setting something heavy down after a long carry, the relief not triumphant but physical. The quiet bodily relief of that weight is not mine to hold anymore. She picked up her coffee. She finished it. She went to get dressed because there were things to do and the day was already in motion. The news broke by 9 that morning, and by noon it had the full velocity of a major financial scandal running across every outlet that covered markets. The details that emerged through the day were, individually, things Selena had already known, but seeing them in print, under bylines, attributed to official sources, confirmed by the SFO in their brief factual statement, had a quality that her weeks of private knowledge hadn't had. It was no longer a case she was building in her head. It was a public fact. It existed in the world independent of her now. The charges, as initially described, covered securities fraud, market manipulation, and fraudulent misrepresentation to investors. The Reed cap payments were cited as central to the fraud allegation. Prosecutors, according to Claire's reporting, had traced the beneficial ownership chain further than Selena had managed from public data alone. They had records that established Cassandra's direct financial interest in the consulting entity and documented communications discussing the payments in terms that left very little interpretive room. A second executive was named before the end of the day. Nexora's CFO, a man named Philip Greer, who had been at the company 11 years and whose signature was on several of the most problematic quarterly disclosures. He was not arrested, but was described as cooperating with the investigation. Jeffrey Marsh issued a statement on behalf of the board by mid-afternoon. It was the statement of an organization in damage control mode. Measured acknowledgement of the investigation, commitment to full cooperation, reiteration of the company's core business strengths, and the careful language of institutional distance from individuals whose conduct was now under formal scrutiny. Reading it, Selena thought about a hotel lobby and a man checking his phone, and about the expression on his face when she'd told him to check the stock prices. She wondered if he'd ever worked out who she was. She suspected he had. Ethan came home at 6:30, which was earlier than usual, and he came home alone, which was not. For the past 2 weeks, he'd been meeting his solicitor every few days, sometimes at the office, sometimes at the solicitor's practice in Gray's Inn. He dropped his bag and stood in the hallway for a moment before coming through to the kitchen where Selena was putting together something for dinner with the kind of mechanical competence that meant her head was elsewhere. "Philip Greer is cooperating," he said. "I saw. That means they have internal documentation now. Communications." He leaned against the doorframe. He looked tired, but it was a different kind of tired than the past 2 weeks. Not the barely managed anxiety of a situation still unfolding, but something that had settled, the way a landscape settles after weather has moved through. "My solicitor says I should expect to be contacted for a witness interview, as someone with knowledge of the organization, not as a subject." "That's a meaningfully different status," Selena said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "She also said that if I had any concerns about my own exposure on any actions I was aware of or involved in, now would be the time to address them proactively, rather than wait to be asked." Selena kept her hands moving over the chopping board. "And do you?" "I've been thinking about that for 2 weeks." He came further into the kitchen, sat down at the table. "The compliance concern that was raised internally, the one the Herald source mentioned, I knew about it. I was copied on a summary document about 6 months before Daniel Price left. The summary said the concern had been reviewed and resolved. I didn't question that." "Did you believe it?" A pause. "I wanted to believe it." She stopped chopping. She turned to look at him. "I'm going to tell my solicitor about the document," he said. "I should have raised it and I didn't. I don't think it rises to criminal exposure, but I'm not going to pretend I had no knowledge of any irregularities. I'm not going to do that." She looked at him for a moment. "Good," she said. "Just that." He nodded. He looked at the table surface. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this, and I don't think there's a good way to do it, so—" He stopped, started again. "I owe you an apology that's bigger than the place card. I owe you an apology for what the past few years have actually been. I kept telling myself the trade-offs were temporary, that we were building towards something, that things would even out when the company got to the next stage, when my position was more secure, when—" He stopped. "There was always a next stage, and the evening out never came, and I let it not come because it was convenient for me." She said nothing. She let him say what he was saying. "The place card that was the moment I should have chosen, clearly, and I didn't. I know that's not the only moment. I know there were years of moments before that, but that one I can see most clearly now for what it was, and I'm sorry for it, specifically and without qualification." He looked up. "You deserved better than how I've handled being your husband." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in a long time. She recognized it as honest because it didn't ask anything of her. It didn't come with an implicit request to forgive him in the same breath, or to reassure him that it wasn't that bad, or to meet his honesty with reciprocal warmth that would allow the conversation to end in a place of comfort. It was just an accurate statement, delivered as one. She turned back to the counter. She finished what she was doing. She moved the chopped vegetables to a pan. "Thank you," she said finally, "for saying that. Does it change anything?" She thought about that question with the seriousness it deserved. "Not about the marriage," she said, "but it matters anyway. You can say something true and important even when it doesn't change the outcome. That's not nothing." He sat with that. "Okay," he said. They ate dinner together that night at the kitchen table, which they hadn't done in the same way in a long time. Not the parallel performance of a couple eating dinner, but two people who were in the process of concluding something and were doing it with more mutual honesty than they'd managed to bring to the preceding years. They talked about logistics, eventually, about the apartment, about timelines, about the practical architecture of separating two lives that had been practically combined for 7 years. Neither of them made it ugly. There was no anger in the room, which surprised Selena slightly and probably surprised Ethan too. But she understood, when she thought about it, the anger had burned off weeks ago, in the office in front of the laptop at 3 in the morning. What was left was something more honest and considerably sadder, and sadness, unlike anger, didn't require a target. She found a flat in Bermondsey the following week. It was on the second floor of a converted warehouse building, smaller than the apartment she shared with Ethan, but well laid out, with good light from the east-facing windows and a second bedroom she could use as an office. The building was quiet. The neighborhood was somewhere she knew. She'd worked in the area briefly years ago and liked the particular quality of it, the mix of old and new, the river not far off. She stood in the empty main room, with the letting agent explaining the terms, and she looked at the light coming through the east windows and thought, this is a place I could think in. She signed the lease on a Friday afternoon. She moved over a weekend in January with the help of a friend from her Canary Wharf days named Joe, who showed up with a hired van and strong opinions about the correct way to wrap glassware, and who did not once ask Selena how she was feeling in a way that required a processed emotional response. Joe asked practical questions. Where does this go? Do you need this shelf unit? Have you eaten anything today? And Selena found this so exactly what she needed that she had to stop once in the kitchen of the new flat and stand with her back to Joe for a moment. You okay? Joe asked. Yes. A brief pause. No. Somewhere in between. That's about right, Joe said. Here, put these glasses in the top cupboard and tell me where you want the kettle. Starting at Caldwell Meridian the second week of January was, in one sense, the simplest part of everything that had happened since November. She knew this work. She had always known it. The language of it, the methodology, the specific pleasure of a financial structure revealing itself under sustained examination. None of that had gone anywhere. It had been sitting in a room she hadn't been opening, and when she opened it again, it was all still there. A little dusty maybe, ready. Her team was 6 people. She inherited them from the previous research lead, who had left on reasonable terms for a position in New York, and who had built a capable but somewhat cautious department, good at confirming things that were already assumed, less practiced at looking for things that weren't yet suspected. That would change. She'd been clear with Harriet about her approach before she accepted the role, and Harriet had been clear that it was exactly the approach she wanted. The first week she mostly listened. She sat in on her team's existing workflow, read their outstanding research, asked questions about methodology without yet directing changes. She wanted to understand what they were good at before she asked them to do something different. A woman named Priya, who'd been with the team 4 years, had a particular gift for identifying related party transactions in complex corporate structures. A man named Ben had strong skills in statistical analysis, but had never been asked to apply them to behavioral pattern identification. Selena noted these things and said very little. On Friday afternoon of the first week, she sat down with Harriet for a brief check-in. First impressions? Harriet asked. Good team, underutilized. Selena set her notes on the edge of Harriet's desk. They've been doing solid confirmatory work. I want to move them towards something more investigative. It'll require some reskilling, but the foundation is there. Timeline? 6 months to see meaningful change in output. 3 months before they're operating in a way that's noticeably different. Harriet looked at her over the top of her glasses. You're not uncertain about this. I'm uncertain about plenty of things, not about what good analytical work looks like. Harriet almost smiled. It was the closest she came to it, Selena would learn, that compressed, slightly sardonic expression that substituted for warmer displays. All right, she said, make it work. Cassandra Reed was formally charged in the 3rd week of January. The charges covered securities fraud, market manipulation, and breach of fiduciary duty, the last one carrying significant personal financial liability in addition to the criminal exposure. Her lawyers entered a not guilty plea on her behalf and issued a statement through a PR firm describing the charges as politically motivated and the evidence as mischaracterized. The statement was confident, and Selena read it with the professional attention of someone assessing an argument and concluded it was the statement of a team that was doing what it could with what it had, which wasn't enough. Philip Greer, the CFO, had entered into a cooperation agreement. The terms weren't public, but the agreement itself was. And it was the agreement that mattered, because a cooperating insider with access to communications and financial records was the kind of evidentiary development that tended to resolve the question of outcome, even if the formal process took another year or two to complete. The Nexora board had announced a comprehensive governance review and appointed interim executive leadership. Trading in the company's shares had resumed at significantly reduced levels. Several large institutional investors had disclosed material reductions in their positions. The company was not dead. Its underlying technology business was real and had customers and generated revenue, but it had been stripped of the false elevation that had kept its valuation where it was, and what remained was considerably smaller than what had been claimed. This was, Selena thought, what accountability actually looked like in practice. Not a clean implosion, not a satisfying overnight collapse, a slow, unglamorous process of reality reasserting itself. Auditors and regulators, and analysts and journalists all doing their separate work, the truth surfacing not in one dramatic moment, but in increments, each one making the next easier. She'd seen it before. She'd helped make it happen before. She'd been away from it long enough to have forgotten that this was what she was good at, and coming back to it had the strange quality of all genuine returns, both familiar and changed, yourself and not quite yourself, the same skill in a different hand. What? She and Ethan finalized the separation agreement in the first week of February. The process had been, by the standards of these things, relatively clean. They had no children, the finances were substantially separate. The apartment was his tenancy rather than jointly owned. There were things to divide and things to negotiate, and moments in the solicitor's office where the paper reality of ending a 7-year marriage landed with a weight that the preceding months of emotional processing had not entirely prepared either of them for. But they got through it. They were not cruel to each other. They did not perform coldness they didn't feel or warmth they didn't have. They were two people concluding something honestly, which was more than a lot of people managed. Outside the solicitor's office afterward, they stood on the pavement for a moment in the February air. Gray day, people moving past, a bus pulling away from the stop across the street. It was a completely ordinary setting for a completely significant moment. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked. He'd been asking this throughout the process, not as a conversational filler, but genuinely, as a question he wanted an accurate answer to. "I think so," she said. "Are you?" He considered it. Getting there. He looked at the street rather than at her. "I heard you've been doing strong work at Caldwell Meridian. There are people in the industry talking about the research output." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Marcus Webb mentioned it. He runs a small fund. We've worked together. He said there's a new research head at Caldwell who's been producing analysis that's..." His word was sharp. He didn't know it was you. A pause. "I didn't tell him." She looked away. The bus across the street was gone now. A woman in a yellow coat was walking a dog that was pulling towards something on the pavement. The ordinary city, doing its ordinary thing. "That's good to hear," she said. "Selena." He said her name like a question and then didn't follow it with a question. He seemed to decide something, and whatever he decided came out as, "I hope it keeps going well. Genuinely. I mean that." She looked at him. She believed him. Whatever else had been true and untrue about the past years, this was true. He was capable of meaning it, and she believed he did. "Take care of yourself," she said. "Talk to your solicitor about the compliance document before the FCA interview, not after." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the expression of a person hearing familiar advice from someone who gives it because they actually care about the outcome, not as a performance. "Right," he said. "I will." She walked to the tube station. She didn't look back, not because she was being deliberate about not looking back, but because she was already thinking about Tuesday's briefing. There was a pharmaceutical company her team was reviewing with a subsidiary structure that had a smell to it, a specific kind of accounting conservatism that was too perfect to be accidental, and she had a thread to pull. Bashab. She was in the office until 7:30 that Tuesday evening, and she would have stayed later except that Priya knocked on the glass partition at 7:20 and said, with the combination of professional deference and human common sense that Selena had come to genuinely appreciate in her, "I'm heading out. Have you eaten anything since lunch?" Selena looked up. She thought about it honestly. "No. There's a place 2 streets over that's still serving. You should go. I'll finish this first. You said that about the last 2 evenings." Priya leaned against the doorframe. "The thread will still be there tomorrow. You found it. It's not going anywhere." Selena looked at her notes, at the screen, at the particular piece of analysis she'd been in the middle of when Priya knocked. 20 minutes, she said. Priya raised an eyebrow. "Genuinely, 20 minutes." Priya looked unconvinced but nodded and left. Selena turned back to the screen. She worked for 17 minutes and then closed the laptop with the clean decision of someone who has learned, or is learning, that the work doesn't require her to burn everything else to keep it going. That was a newer understanding, not fully integrated yet. She was still capable of losing entire evenings to a good thread, but present, growing, the beginning of a different relationship with the thing she did for a living. One where it was hers rather than where she was its. She put her coat on. She turned the office light off. In the corridor, the building was mostly empty. A few late workers here and there, the cleaning team moving through with quiet efficiency. She pressed the button for the lift and waited, looking at the floor numbers counting down. She thought about the pharmaceutical company's subsidiary. She thought about Tuesday's briefing and about the question she was going to put to Ben about the statistical methodology for the behavioral analysis. She thought about Priya's blunt common sense and about Joe and the glasses in the top cupboard. She thought about the light through the east-facing windows of the Bermondsey flat in the early morning, how it came in at a low angle in winter and hit the desk at the far end of the main room. She thought about how long it had been since she had a space she moved through as herself, entirely, without the constant low-level calculation of how much room to take up, how much noise to make, which version of herself to leave at the door. The lift arrived. She stepped in. She thought, this is what it feels like. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. Something more durable than happiness. The feeling of living at your actual scale, inside your actual capabilities, as the actual version of yourself. The feeling you get when the long detour ends and you find yourself, unexpectedly, back on the road you should have been on all along. She pressed the ground floor button. The doors closed. She went down. March came in cold and stayed that way, the kind of early spring that doesn't commit, bright enough in the mornings to suggest the season was turning, cold enough by afternoon to remind you it hadn't. Selena had started taking the long route to work when the weather allowed, walking from the Bermondsey flat down through Tooley Street and along the river before crossing at London Bridge. It added 20 minutes. She took them anyway. There was something in the quality of the Thames in winter light, the gray-green of it, the way it moved without hurrying, that she found steadying in a way she hadn't expected when she started doing it. She was not a person who had historically given much thought to walks. She was a person who got from one place to another. But since January, she'd been noticing that some of the clearest thinking she did happened on those 20 minutes of river, when her hands were cold and her mind was loose, and the next thread in whatever she was working on would sometimes just arrive, unhurried, the way solutions do when you stop forcing them. The pharmaceutical company case had opened into something larger than her original thread. What she'd identified in February as suspicious accounting conservatism in the subsidiary structure had, under the sustained examination of her team over 6 weeks, revealed itself to be a classic revenue timing manipulation. The kind where quarterly earnings were smoothed across reporting periods to maintain analyst expectations, with the smoothing mechanism buried in inter-company loan arrangements that were technically disclosed but practically invisible, without the kind of relational mapping that most research teams didn't bother with. She had bothered. Ben had built the statistical model. Priya had traced the related party connections. It was clean, careful work, and when she presented it to Harriet at the end of February, Harriet had looked at the documentation for a long time without speaking, and then said, "This goes to the investment committee tomorrow." "It's ready," Selena said. "I know it is." Harriet set the report down. I want to say something that I don't say very often, because I find it tends to make people either arrogant or anxious, and neither is useful. A brief pause. This is exactly the standard I hoped for. Selena said thank you and meant it simply, without the complicated undertow that compliments used to carry, the old reflex to minimize them, to find the qualification, to manage how much of yourself you were allowed to claim. She'd been working on that, not always successfully, but working on it. The investment committee acted on the report. Caldwell Meridian reduced its position in the pharmaceutical company by 60% before the company's next earnings report, which came in significantly below expectations and triggered a broad reassessment of its valuation methodology by several analysts. No formal investigation resulted. The manipulation was aggressive, but stopped short of what regulators typically pursued criminally. But the institutional awareness it generated was real, and the investors who'd relied on Caldwell Meridian's research had been protected from a position that would have cost them significantly. That was what the work was, at its best. Not always the dramatic public exposure, not always the fraud charge and the front-page headline, sometimes just the quiet protection, the money that didn't get lost, the investors who didn't get hurt, because someone looked carefully enough and early enough and said, something here is not what it's being presented as. Selena had always known that. She just needed to find her way back to where she could do it. Claire Ashworth called her on a Tuesday in mid-March. Not a text this time, an actual call, which was unusual for Claire, who tended to communicate in the compressed, efficient style of someone managing 12 things simultaneously. I wanted to tell you before it runs tomorrow, Claire said. Selena was at her desk. She set down the document she'd been reading. Tell me what? We have the recap paper trail, the full ownership chain, all the way through the beneficial structure to Cassandra directly. The SFO shared it with us as part of the background briefing on the charges. A pause. Along with the internal communications. There are emails, Selena. Emails between Cassandra and Greer discussing the payments, using language that leaves absolutely no room for the interpretation they've been trying to make in public. Selena was quiet for a moment. When does it run? Tomorrow morning. Front page, full package, it's going to be the definitive account. Claire stopped. Then, I also want to say something, off the record. Okay. You built the architecture of this story before the FCA investigation, before Greer cooperated, before any of the institutional machinery got involved. What you brought to me was the structure that made everything else possible to investigate. I don't think I said that clearly enough at the time. Selena looked at the desk surface, at the notepad she kept for the kind of thoughts that needed to be written by hand rather than typed. She thought about a cafe in Fitzrovia and a journalist who'd opened her notebook with professional deliberateness and asked sharp questions and not accepted easy answers. You did the journalism, Selena said. That part was yours. It was a collaboration. A brief, characteristically compressed pause. I don't collaborate easily. I wanted you to know that it mattered. It mattered to me too, Selena said. Thank you for calling. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after Claire hung up. Then she put it on the desk and picked up the document she'd been reading and went back to work, because that was what she did now. And it wasn't a lesser thing for being ordinary. The article ran Wednesday, and it was, as Claire had said, definitive. The emails were devastating in the specific way of communications written by people who believed they were safe, casual, direct, occasionally contemptuous of the investors they were deceiving. There was one exchange in particular between Cassandra and Greer from 18 months before the Gala, in which the two of them discussed the recap payment structure with the offhand familiarity of people who had long since stopped thinking of it as something they needed to be careful about. The Herald's coverage triggered a cascade. By afternoon, 3 major financial outlets had filed their own stories. By evening, Cassandra's PR firm had released a statement abandoning the politically motivated framing and replacing it with the significantly less confident language of counsel advising their client to let the legal process proceed. The shift in language was itself a kind of statement. Lawyers only made that pivot when the alternative was making things worse. Selena read the coverage on her lunch break, eating at her desk, something Priya had tried and failed 3 times to reform her about. She read it carefully and without particular emotion, the way you read the closing documentation on something you've been working on for a long time. She noted what was accurate and what was missing, what questions remained open and what had been resolved. She thought about Jeffrey Marsh, who had by now been thoroughly briefed on who she was and who had, according to a brief item in one of the financial bulletins, expressed deep regret for the institutional failures and announced a full board reconstitution. She thought about the warning she'd given him in a ballroom lobby and about how the value of that warning had not been in whether he'd acted on it in the moment. He hadn't, not really, but in the small seed of awareness it had planted, the thing that had made him easier to reach when the FCA came calling and cooperation became the calculation that mattered. She thought about all the places in a sequence of events where a different decision could have sent it somewhere else entirely. She had made a decision in an office at 3 in the morning because something had finally broken through the management and the accommodation and the careful arrangement of a life that wasn't really hers anymore. She had followed that decision through its consequences, some of which she'd anticipated and some of which she hadn't, and she'd come out the other side of it here, in this office, with this work, with this team, with this specific version of herself that felt, for the first time in a long time, like the actual version. None of it had been clean. She hadn't always been sure. She had done things she'd need to continue to sit with, the question of Ethan's career exposure, which she'd understood and accepted as part of the cost, but which was still real, still his to carry. She had built a case using information she'd gathered in the aftermath of her own humiliation, which meant her motivations were never purely professional, never the uncomplicated pursuit of justice that made for a cleaner story. She had been hurt, and she had been angry, and some of what she'd done had been fueled by both of those things as much as by principle. She thought it mattered to be honest about that, to not rewrite herself as a cleaner protagonist than she'd actually been. The hurt was real, and the anger was real, and the principle was also real, and all three of them had worked together in a way that you couldn't separate out and evaluate individually because that's not how human beings actually operate. She'd done something right, and she'd done it for complicated reasons. Both were true at the same time. The divorce was finalized at the end of March. She signed the papers in her solicitor's office on a Thursday afternoon. Her solicitor, a careful Glaswegian woman named Sandra, who communicated primarily in understatement and whom Selena had come to like precisely because of it. Sandra had walked her through the documentation once, confirmed there were no outstanding issues, and set the papers in front of her with the quiet professionalism of someone who had done this 1,000 times and understood that the appropriate response was competent neutrality. Selena read each page before she signed it. This was not a stall, it was just her nature. She read what she signed. Sandra sat across the desk and waited without fidgeting, which Selena appreciated. On the last page, she held the pen for a moment. She was not performing the pause. She was just in it. The actual, unmanaged experience of sitting at a desk in a gray-carpeted office in the middle of a Thursday afternoon and ending something that had taken 7 years to build and another 7 months to honestly examine. There was grief in it. She didn't try to argue herself out of that. She'd loved Ethan Cross in the way of a person who is genuinely capable of love, without irony, without protection, with the particular vulnerability that comes from believing another person will handle what you've given them with care. He hadn't always handled it with care, but she hadn't always been clear about what she needed, and she'd confused endurance for loyalty for long enough that neither of them had done the other any favors. She didn't blame him simply, and she didn't excuse him simply, and she thought that was probably the correct position to hold, the one that was accurate rather than tidy. She signed. Sandra collected the document with a small nod. "That's everything." "Thank you," Selena said. She came out of the office building onto the street and stood in the early spring air for a moment. Cold still, but with something in it. A quality of shift, the season slowly making its argument. She checked her phone. She had a missed call from Priya and a message from Joe that said dinner Friday, and an email from Harriet flagging a new due diligence request that had come in that afternoon. She put the phone back in her bag. She walked to the tube station. She went back to work. The conversation she had needed to have with Roz happened over dinner in April, at a restaurant in Borough Market that they'd been vaguely intending to try for years, and had finally gotten to through the particular combination of calendar alignment and the mutual feeling that there was something to mark, though neither of them had said it in those terms when they'd made the booking. They ordered wine that was slightly better than either of them would normally have justified on a weekday, and they talked about the Nixora case as it stood, Cassandra's trial date set for October, Greer's cooperation agreement holding, the company in the slow institutional process of attempting to rebuild credibility under new governance. Roz had heard from a contact at the SFO that the evidentiary case was strong, that the communications recovered from internal servers had more than delivered what the recap paper trail had promised. The outcome of the trial was not certain. Outcomes never were. But the direction of things was clear. Daniel Price has been contacted, Roz said, as a potential witness. His NDA was reviewed by his own counsel, and the consensus is that it doesn't cover testimony in criminal proceedings in the way the company structured it. How is he handling that? Carefully, but he's not running away from it. Roz turned her wine glass slightly. He told me, through my contact, not directly, that when he raised the concern internally and got pushed out for it, he felt like he'd done the right thing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He said what happened afterward made him feel like maybe the timing had just been off. Selena thought about that, about a man who'd done what he was supposed to do and been shown the door for it, who'd spent 18 months in a job he'd taken because the alternative was nothing, waiting without quite knowing what he was waiting for. The timing wasn't off, she said. It just needed more pieces. Roz looked at her. That's probably what he needed to hear. He'll get to say it in court. She picked up her glass. That counts for something. They ate and they talked. Not all about Nexora, not all about work. Roz was in the middle of something of her own, a case she was consulting on that she could describe only in general terms, and she described it in those terms with the professional opacity that Selena had always respected in her. They talked about other things, about a film they'd both seen, about Roz's daughter who was applying to universities and who apparently had the same difficulty with decisions that Roz had, a fact Rose reported with the precise mix of pride and exasperation that was the unique emotional signature of recognizing yourself in someone you're raising. Toward the end of the meal, Rose said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Yes." "Are you all right? Not about the case, not about the job, just you." Selena looked at her across the table. It was the question she'd been asked in various forms since November, mostly by Joe, and occasionally by Douglas, and once by her mother in a phone call that had been longer and more honest than most of their phone calls. She'd gotten better at answering it without the deflection. The automatic fine, everything's fine that had been her reflex for so long she'd stopped noticing she was using it. "I'm better than I was," she said. "Some days significantly. Some days it's still—" She moved her hand slightly, the gesture meaning not there yet. The end of a marriage is the end of a marriage. You don't just efficiently process it and move forward. Or at least I don't. Nobody does, Rose said. Anyone who says they did is compressing the timeline. It's also, she paused, looking for the accurate word, strange to be this version of myself now, the one that feels like the right one, and to know that getting here required everything that happened the way it happened. She looked at the table. I don't know how to feel about the fact that it took something that bad to make this happen. I can't decide whether that's motivating or depressing. Maybe it's neither, Rose said. Maybe it's just true. Selena looked at her. That's either very wise or very unhelpful. Often the same thing, Roz said, and topped up both their glasses. She went back to the Bermondsey flat that night and stood at the east-facing window for a while before she went to bed. The city below was doing what it did at 11 on a weeknight, reduced but not quiet, the particular hum of a place that never entirely stopped. Across the rooftop she could see a strip of river, dark and moving. She'd started to think of the river as her most reliable companion in this new version of life. Not sentimental about it, just aware of it. The way it was always there when she passed it, moving in its own direction, indifferent to everything above it, doing only what it was built to do. She thought about Roz's question. Are you all right? She thought about all the ways she could answer it and about which answer was truest. The truest answer was complicated, because she was not a person for whom the truest answer was ever simple, and she had stopped apologizing for that. She was better. She was a long way from where she'd been the night of the gala. That woman who had stood in a ballroom with a cruel card in her hand and nowhere left to put the accumulated weight of years, who had walked out through a pair of doors into November air and made a decision she didn't know yet was a decision. She was also still in the middle of it, in the honest sense. The grief didn't follow a schedule. Some mornings she woke up clear and purposeful, and the day had the forward momentum she'd been building toward. Other mornings she woke up with the weight of something unresolved sitting on her chest. Not regret exactly, not longing exactly. Something harder to name than either. The end of a long relationship, even one that had needed to end, takes up space in a way that doesn't conveniently clear when the paperwork is done. She was allowing herself to know that. She was not compressing the timeline, as Roz had said, or trying to skip to the part where it was behind her. There was something, she thought, in that, in the allowing, in sitting with the complicated truth of where she was instead of managing her way past it. She had spent 7 years managing her needs, her ambitions, her disappointment, the growing gap between who she was and how she was living. Management was a survival skill, and it had kept her functional, but it had also kept her from seeing clearly, and seeing clearly was the thing that had finally made everything else possible. She thought about something Douglas had said to her in a phone call 2 weeks after she'd started at Caldwell Meridian. He'd called to check in, gruffly, because that was his way. The check-in disguised as a professional inquiry about whether she was finding the adjustment back to full-time work manageable. She'd told him she was. He'd made a sound that could be interpreted as satisfaction. Then, as he was ending the call, he said, "For what it's worth, I always thought you were doing something smaller than yourself. Glad you stopped." She had not responded to that in the moment. She'd said goodbye and hung up and sat with it for the rest of the day. She sat with it again now, at the window with the city below her and the river moving in the dark. Doing something smaller than yourself. She understood now that this was what had actually been happening. Not a temporary compromise, not a season of adjustment, but a sustained reduction. A life calibrated to fit inside someone else's requirements. And the strange thing was that she had chosen it, and the accumulation of small choices she'd told herself were reasonable and temporary, until the accumulation became so large she could no longer see it clearly. She did not blame Ethan for all of it. She had said this to herself before, and she meant it each time she said it. He had taken what was offered and not asked hard enough questions about the cost. That was real. But she had been the one offering, and somewhere in the offering she had lost track of the difference between generosity and erasure. She thought women were sometimes taught, not taught exactly, but shaped by 1,000 small cultural pressures barely visible individually, to read the reduction of themselves as a form of care. As proof that they weren't difficult, weren't too much, were the right kind of person to love. She had been shaped that way. She had not always resisted it with the same force she now understood was available to her. That was the part she kept returning to. Not with guilt. Guilt implied she could have done better with the understanding she'd had at the time, and she wasn't sure that was fair, but with the clear-eyed recognition that what you allow to happen to yourself is not always something that happens to you. Sometimes you participate in it. And knowing that was not a reason for self-recrimination, but for something more useful. The honest accounting of how you got here, and what you're going to do differently with what you now know. The trial date moved once, from October to January of the following year, for reasons to do with the volume of evidentiary material and the scheduling of expert witnesses. Selina followed this from a distance. It was no longer her work in an active sense. She had handed what she'd built to people whose job it was to take it forward, and taking it forward was their responsibility now. She checked in with Claire occasionally. She got updates from Rose when they had them. She was not indifferent to the outcome. She wanted Cassandra Reed to stand in a courtroom and have the full weight of what she'd done placed on the record. Not because it would satisfy some private score. She was honest with herself that the score existed, but she was also honest that personal satisfaction was not the same as justice, and she'd stopped confusing them. But because accountability, real and formal accountability, was what the people whose investment money had been manipulated deserved. The rest of it she let go. She had to. There was a specific skill in that, one she'd had to develop consciously, knowing which threads were yours to hold and which ones you had to release. She'd been bad at releasing things. She was getting better. In November, a full year after the gala, though she didn't mark the anniversary in any deliberate way, it just arrived in the texture of the month. She was invited to speak on a panel at an industry conference on financial research methodology. The invitation came through Harriet, who'd been asked to participate and had declined in favor of sending Selina in her place with the characteristic efficiency of a person who identified the correct move and made it without unnecessary explanation. The panel was at a hotel in Canary Wharf, not far from the office she'd worked in a decade ago, back when she was the version of herself who could hold a complex financial structure in her head the way some people held music. She got ready for it in the Bermondsey flat on a Thursday morning, standing in front of the bathroom mirror with her coffee, doing what she needed to do. She looked at herself. She was 40 years old. She had lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, and she had not slept 8 hours consistently since sometime in late October when a new due diligence case had come in that genuinely required the late evenings, not the anxious performance of them. She had got her hair cut shorter than she'd had it in years, not as a statement, but because she'd been busy and it was practical, and when she'd looked in the mirror after the cut, she'd thought it suited her, and the thinking had been quick and uncomplicated in the way that thoughts about yourself can be when you've stopped watching yourself from the outside the whole time. She thought, I know who I am. She'd had that thought once before, at this same mirror, before a gala she'd been told mattered. She'd had it and then suppressed it because the timing seemed strange. It hadn't been strange. It had been the most accurate thing about that evening, arriving at exactly the right moment. She just hadn't been ready to act on it yet. She was ready now. She had been ready for some time. The panel went well, which she registered with honest pleasure, and not the deflecting modesty that sometimes masqueraded as humility. She knew her subject. She spoke about it clearly, pushed back when another panelist offered a take she thought was imprecise, answered audience questions without padding, and left when it was done without attending the networking drinks, because she'd never actually liked networking drinks and had reached the age where she no longer felt obligated to pretend. She walked back to the tube through Canary Wharf in the November afternoon. The glass towers, the piazza, the particular ambition of the place, its argument about what success looked like. She had worked here once, she had learned here. She did not have uncomplicated feelings about it, but she did not need her feelings to be uncomplicated to move through the space without being diminished by it. On the tube, she found a seat and took out her phone and saw a message from Joe. How'd it go? She typed back, Good. Going home. Dinner? Sunday? Joe replied with 3 words. Yes. Bring wine. She smiled. She put the phone away. At London Bridge, she came up from the station into the late afternoon and turned toward Bermondsey, and the river was there on her left as she walked. Gray and moving, the same as always, doing only what it was built to do. She passed a couple walking a dog that was wildly enthusiastic about a pigeon that had absolutely no intention of being caught. She passed a man selling the Evening Standard, who nodded at her in the way of someone who recognized a regular without quite knowing why. She passed a coffee shop with steam on the windows, and people inside bent over laptops in the blue-lit way of late Thursday afternoons. She walked at a pace that was hers. She was thinking about the pharmaceutical follow-up brief she needed to finish before Friday, and about the methodology questions she still had for Ben, and about whether the Japanese green tea she'd ordered from the online shop had arrived at the flat. She was thinking about Sunday dinner with Joe and about her mother's birthday next month, and about the way the east-facing windows would look tomorrow morning with low winter sun coming in at the angle it had been coming in since January, hitting the desk at the far end of the room. She was thinking about all of it at once, which was normal and fine and hers. She thought, without deciding to think it, about the woman who had sat at a table in a ballroom a year ago and read a card with her name on it and the worst version of what someone else thought of her, and had felt the thing inside her finally stop cooperating with the performance of smallness. That woman had been hurt, and she had been angry, and she had walked out of that room and done something with both of those things that became, over time, something larger than either of them. Something that protected people, that told the truth, that rebuilt on an honest foundation rather than a borrowed one. She was not entirely that woman anymore. She was a year past her, and carrying what the year had made. There was something she'd been sitting with for months that she hadn't quite found words for. And walking by the river in November, it came to her with the quiet arrival of things that have been working themselves out in the background. It was this. The greatest risk she'd ever taken was not the Nixora investigation. The investigation had been work, hard, careful, consequential work. But work she was skilled for, work that required intelligence and discipline and the willingness to follow a thread wherever it went. Those things she had. They'd been hers all along. The real risk was the one before that. The one that happened at a bathroom mirror before a gala, or in a parking garage after a phone call, or in the thousand small moments over years when she'd felt the distance between who she was and how she was living and had chosen, each time, not to close it. The real risk, the one that actually costs something, the one that doesn't come with a methodology or a skill set, was finally deciding that who you actually were was worth the disruption of living as her. That risk had no guaranteed return. She had taken it anyway. She had taken it badly in places, imperfectly, with mixed motivations and incomplete information, and the fear that lives underneath every real change, the fear that the person you're becoming doesn't exist yet, and the person you're leaving behind was at least known. She had taken it, and it had cost her a marriage that had needed to end, and a version of herself that had needed to end with it. And here she was on the other side of it, in a coat she liked and a job that was hers, and a life that fit at its actual dimensions. And the grief was real, and the freedom was also real, and neither of those things required the other to be smaller. That was what she knew now that she hadn't known in November of last year. Not that she was better than the people who'd underestimated her. She'd never needed that to be true to know her own worth. Not that the world was fair, or that good work was always recognized, or that the people who harm you always face the consequences. Those things were sometimes true and sometimes not, and understanding that was part of being an adult. What she knew was simpler and harder than any of that. She knew that living at a reduced size, for whatever reason and however it came to feel normal, was not something she was willing to do again. Not for a relationship, not for comfort, not for the path of least resistance. She'd learned the cost of it too clearly. She turned off the river path and onto her street, the one with the converted warehouse building, the entry code she'd memorized in January. She could see the light she'd left on in the flat, the warm rectangle of the east-facing window, visible from the street, the same light that came in at a low angle in the mornings and hit the desk where she worked. She stopped for a moment on the pavement and looked up at it. She thought about what it meant to have a place that was entirely yours. Not as a statement, not as a symbol of independence in the performed way, just practically, specifically, a space where you moved as yourself, at your own pace, in your own direction, without the constant negotiation of shared territory that had, she now saw, been slowly exhausting her for years. She was tired tonight, not the hollow tired of the past years, the tired of having given things away, but the solid, earned tired of someone who had worked a full day on something that mattered. That was a different thing. It felt like money in a bank you actually owned. She punched in the entry code. The door opened. She went upstairs. She made tea she intended to drink before it went cold, which happened about 60% of the time now, up from roughly 20. She took off her coat and her good shoes and put on the things she wore when she wasn't performing anything. She sat at the desk by the east-facing window and pulled the Friday brief toward her and looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it and started to read, and the city went on below her in the dark, and the river moved, and somewhere in an office building in the financial district, a version of the work she'd spent years doing was continuing without her for tonight, carried forward by people she'd taught and would keep teaching, the thread running on. She read until the tea was half gone. Then she stopped and closed the brief and sat with her hands around the warm mug and looked at nothing in particular. She let herself be exactly where she was for a moment. Just that, nothing performed or projected or prepared for. Just the flat and the light and the quiet and the woman in it. She was enough. She had always been enough. It had just taken a while to stop arguing with that,